Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining another episode of the Product Management Learning Series. My name is Shavi. I'm a product lead at LinkedIn. Please drop in the chat where you're joining us from. Welcome. So as many of you know, the Product Management Learning Series is a series of live streaming events where industry thought leaders and practitioners share their PM career journeys and lessons learned building products to inspire current and aspiring product builders like you to level up your product career. We are starting a very special series where we feature product leaders from leading AI and generative AI companies building interesting AI related products. So join us to explore the challenges and opportunities in this very transformative paradigm shift in tech and gain insights from those leading the charge in the AI and generative AI space. So please make sure you subscribe to newsletter, which you can find the link in the event's details tab to receive recap from key takeaways from today's event, as well as future event updates. Now, without further ado, today with me, I want to introduce you to Chris. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, how's it going?
So Chris is a chaotic good product manager. That's a very interesting brand. We'll dive into that in a moment. Chris is also a writer and speaker. He has over 20 years of product management leadership experience at well-known companies like the Microsoft, Waze, Kayak, Facebook Reality Labs, and Conexon. He's now the lead product manager at Google's core machine learning team, where he PMs the PM experience and strategy. That's really exciting. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you about a bunch of different things. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, that's awesome. So folks, please continue to drop in the chat, introduce yourself, where you're joining us from. And if you have any question for Chris, please drop in the chat as comments, and Chris will, respond to them as we go through today's show. So Chris, we all know that you're a chaotic, good product manager, but tell us a little bit about your journey into product and the story behind chaotic, good product manager.
Sure. Well, the chaotic good product manager is a little bit of an Easter egg for people that maybe played Dungeons and Dragons back in the day. And so it's meant to be kind of like a character alignment sheet, but I guess I apply it to the way I do my work in that, I think in general, all the different places I've worked at have very, very smart people that are very, very sure about what they should be doing. And I guess I see that there's some benefit in maybe throwing a little bit of chaos or uncertainty into the situation, especially when we start to worry about kind of like, are we being too biased in the way that we end up building things? Are we building things for everybody? I think this type of like chaos is something that's like valuable. And so I do a lot around like randomness and decision making and things like that as well. I have various decks of cards that I end up using as part of my practice as well. And then the good part is just in general, like I guess the thing I'm always trying to do is trying to build kind of better group cohesion and create better ways for us to make decisions together we all feel good about. And so that's kind of the breakdown of the chaotic good. But it is very much inspired from Dungeons and Dragons. And I also do play like role-playing games still, mostly virtually. But that's something I think about a lot. Yeah. And maybe the way I got into product management was I was hired right out of college from an engineering degree into Microsoft as a program manager. And what was really inspiring to me, I was interviewing at a lot of different places that focused on the kind of raw engineering side of the world. And when I was being interviewed at Microsoft, I was asked, how I might design a washer dryer combination for someone that was sight impaired, and that type of kind of thinking about what is the problem we're trying to solve for someone, what is their context, what's their situation, was really kind of interesting to me, and was more interesting than the idea of being kind of a world-class developer, which I kind of realized at an early time that I was probably never going to be that person. So anyways, that was why I ended up getting into product management. And then just over the last long series of kind of roles that have been at both large and small companies, I did my own startup. I worked, as kind of in a lot of innovation type of work. Really, it all comes back to the technology is really just intermediating people. And so from that perspective, if we ever lose sight of that, I think we end up building the wrong thing. And so that to me is what drives really my product management kind of career and the roles that I've taken.
That's awesome. I really enjoy how Dungeons and Dragons can marry together with decision making and the chaotic aspect of PM, and how you kind of making sense of some of this chaotics. That sort of it was is a natural segue for our next question. So you're an expert in navigating strategic ambiguity, and that happens a lot in product, right? Shaping strategies and deciding what to build. How do you create structure to kind of facilitate conversations about ambiguity, because a lot of people are not comfortable with that, right?
Yeah.
And then how do you facilitate effective decision making in light of this ambiguity?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, can I call myself an expert? I mean, I definitely thrive in ambiguity, so maybe that's something I can at least talk about. But yeah, people, if we're all just smart enough, we think hard enough, we believe that we can actually set everything up in the future for success. When the reality is like we don't really understand all of the factors that go into a particular success, and sometimes there's just so many different random elements which we can't even like figure out or include in our decision making process, that we just won't get it right anyways, even if we do the best decision making that we could. And so I think the way I end up really helping people with that is one, I think, asking a lot of questions, right? Asking for more context. I think the second thing is really focusing more on trade-offs and the way that we satisfy things around a decision, I think is really helpful. So what I mean by that is that we'll never make a decision, especially in the complex realms that we usually deal with as product managers, that really makes everybody 100% happy. And so we need to just think about what are the ways that we can at least make our customers happy. We can make our kind of business stakeholders happy. How we can actually find meaning in our own work, and finding the combination of those things it's very hard and requires a lot of teamwork, I think, to get to. And then finally, I would just say, like, one of the things that we end up doing, and I'm part of this project called the Uncertainty Project, which is kind of an online community for decision making and strategic discussion. I think there are these like phases of decision making that we need to allow for. Maybe in the traditional design thinking sense, there's this idea of like divergence and convergent type of activities inside the decision making process. I think my most recent really kind of one thing that everybody should do is try to separate out this discourse versus the decision making. And what we end up doing is we end up muddying those things together. So we're trying to make a decision while also coming up with options, refining options, deciding who is actually the decision maker, and communicate. We do all at the same time. And that means that we end up having lots and lots of meetings that don't really get anywhere. And so I think that separation where we say right now at the beginning, we've identified we need to do something or make a decision about something. Here's actually the people that are the stakeholders or the people that are part of the group that should be making this decision, right? It's within their decision-making authority. It's within their expertise. It's close to where they're actually doing their work. They have the most information. How do we then, once we've identified that, how we should make that decision, deciding how to decide is kind of what I call it. We then have a discourse around what are the options? Do we have all of the options? Do we weigh the options? How do we decide on value of these different options? And then we have the decision-making point. And so like the discourse should have as many people as reasonable to be able to discuss that and add options and add feedback. But there is a certain point where ideally it's one person, maybe it's a small group, but it's not the entire team that ends up actually just making the decision and then moving forward. And then of course there's this idea of like, how do we end up communicating and then learning from our decision-making process? And I think when you start to look at it that way, where we have these different kind of points within a process for a decision, we can allow for uncertainty in certain places around this, right? Like the discourse side, we can really try to amp up the uncertainty, and including things like adding random signals or random constraints or random ideas into the process, because it just all it really does is helps us open our framing into a different way than we would have understood otherwise. So that is maybe the biggest issue about certainty in decision making, is that we have one frame and we feel like it's the only right one, when the reality is there's many different frames that we can take. And that's even why this idea of like using things like tarot cards within this like practice, even the idea of like the I Ching, or all these different things that end up being out there that are kind of more spiritual fortune telling practices, they're usually there to actually help us reframe the way we understand the situation. And so that's like something I'll do at like unconferences, is do like product tarot readings sometimes.
That's
But
awesome.
yeah, but I think there's like something really interesting about this idea of just like reframing the way we think about things. And that's maybe the best way we can start to harness the uncertainty of the world, is just consider additional frames that we wouldn't have considered otherwise.
Yeah, I love how tarot cards marries product management, and the uncertainty project sounds really cool. I like how a lot of times product management we think about we're in the business of solving problems, but actually before even come to there, we are almost in the business of framing and finding what problem to
Absolutely.
solve. So I love the way how you said like creating those processes to allow flexibility and divergent thinking, right? Where we
That's
incorporate
right.
different perspectives, different frames, and then but eventually converge, ideally
Yeah,
with a
that's right.
single D.
Yeah.
To make that decision. And so, for folks who are joining us, please drop in the chat if you have any question for Chris. He will respond. As a comment to respond to the chat. Also, we will be including links to the Uncertainty Project. So make sure you subscribe to our newsletter that goes out every Wednesday that recaps this event. You can find out the link in the events details tab. So thank you so much for following us so far. So, Chris, you have a lot of experience working in the AI and machine learning space. And this series right now, this special series, is about demystifying AI and educating
Yeah.
more folks about AI, right? So, AI right now just gets a lot more popular with the popularity of generative AI in particular.
Mhm.
There's a lot of ambiguity in how you should navigate and how people should think about it, both from the company perspective as well as from almost like a career perspective, right?
Yeah.
So, what would you say, and how would you navigate, some of this strategic ambiguity in the age of AI, and maybe specifically the recent booming of generative AI? What are some potential limits that you see in the space?
Yeah, I think there's I've been doing a more recent talk just about like, is there such a thing as like an AI PM, right? And I guess from my perspective, I think that the things that are really great about like really good or great PMs actually end up doing are things that are fairly technology agnostic, right? Like they tend to be a hyper focus on the customer. How do we do this type of decision facilitation or framing that we were just talking about? How do we like help build alignment and communicate and do a bunch of other things like that? And so I think that doesn't really change, right? Like in that talk, there was someone that in response to my talk was like, was there such a thing as like an HTML PM? And I would agree with that. Like there's probably not as much of a need. Now, the times that there are these types of things, and I've had job titles that have had like mobile in the title back when that was first kind of emerging. I've been the director of AI projects for a design consultancy. And so I think when we're really early stage with a technology and we don't know kind of the characteristics of that technology and how to use it very specifically, I think we do end up having like the need for someone that is not only specializing, so maybe they are kind of like looking at the very early stage uses of these things, but it's also someone who's willing to kind of figure out the rules as they come, right? And so I liken this a lot to when I worked at Kayak. Like that was when there was a transition period from kind of desktop web to mobile as one of their highest usage cases. And so in those cases, it didn't mean that people were traveling more just because they used their mobile phones to look at Kayak more. It was that there was like a different use case for the way that like mobile would work out. It was more of like I would look earlier in the process when it came to kind of looking at traffic and things. We're looking at like travel and things like that. And so I think that that's the same thing right now when we talk about AI and machine learning is that there's a lot of characteristics of this technology that we're kind of discovering and figuring out when we should use it appropriately. And so in the case of like generative systems, right, they are not very factual today. They do something that we call hallucination, but I feel like that is maybe over personification. And that's maybe the other thing is that we just don't have terminology to be able to like say that this thing calculated something is probably not the best way to say it, but it also doesn't think, right, in the way that we understand it. And so I think there's a lot of things about perceptual issues that we need to figure out the terminology for. But in the case of like, a lot of these large language models or even multimodal models that are generating text and imagery and video and also will eventually turn into 3D models and a bunch of other stuff, right? Those things are very interesting and good at maybe inspiring people in a way that they have an idea and they don't know where to go with it. So like that blank page problem, I think is very interesting. But I think when we start then talking about like where is there a need for factual kind of output, there are still way better uses of other types of technologies like search indexing and other things like that, knowledge management, right? Like that still do a better job. Now, there's a lot of work being done where we do a better job of linking this idea of kind of more traditional search indexing and knowledge management with this idea of generative systems. And the fact that we're now calling them generative systems, I think also overshadows the fact that we've had like text summarizers for a very long time. We've just called them summarizers, right? Or we have autocomplete. We just call it autocomplete rather than generative AI system. So I think like looking at the characteristics of the system, and there was a really interesting paper from a little while ago that was all about this idea of like analogical innovation, which is a way that people end up looking at a particular problem, seeing the characteristics or creating a schema of the characteristics of that problem, and then looking across domains, across industries, across like other types of products that may already be solving this problem. And so I think we should do the same thing for a lot of these technologies in the sense of like generative AI, right? It's really good at just kind of like creating a bunch of text about something, right? And you can then combine it with lots of different ideas, and we'll try to do its best job of estimating or simulating what that text should be, right? And so that's great. That's really great for things like if you wanted to create get started on a poem, or you wanted to like have an idea of how these like different concepts may meld together. What's really bad at though is like factual reporting and telling you what is the reality of the world, right? And especially for things that are not in the index, right? Like I'm not a super famous, I'm probably the most famous Chris Butler product manager, but I'm not the most famous Chris Butler. So when I ask it to like generate things about me, it gets a lot of stuff wrong because there's just not a lot of content that's out there. And so then it starts to simulate what it would expect to do in that case. So I think getting back to those, like, what are the characteristics of these technologies? That's what we need to be really hyper aware of. The last thing I would say just about like AI and machine learning in general, when it comes to like product management, a lot of the time is that there are kind of nuances that we need to regard with some type of special kind of concern. And so kind of what type of data we use, is that data kind of biased in certain ways that are bad for the people that we're trying to serve, fairness issues, compliance and kind of consent laws and regulation around privacy and that data. Those are all things that product managers will need to deal with in this world. How we deal with the training cycle and the way that we need to kind of monitor the way things work, because there's this idea of world drift where at a certain point, the model, because it was trained on past data, the future world may change in the way that things end up happening. And so you'll get this drift away from the model performance being high as the world continues to evolve. And so there's a bunch of things like that that I think are kind of very important for product managers to be aware of, and will actually change the practice of product management in some ways. But still, the artifacts are very similar, right? Like we want to understand, is this a concept that's of value to us and the customer? How do we have the right types of cross-functional discussions with engineering and research and legal and privacy and all those people? And then how do we like message this to the customer? And that's where a lot of my background comes from, is more of the human-computer interfaces side of this. Like, how do we build trustworthy and interpretable systems becomes very interesting.
I love that. I feel like that's quite an overview actually of like some of the more detailed stuff that we can talk about in this talk. Let's unpack, right? Let's play some tarot cards or have some fun, gamify our discussion a little bit, since you are very good or known for being able to navigate strategic ambiguity and facilitating decision making. Let's simulate some of the potentials and limitations that you said about AI into some of the common decisions that business might need to make today.
Sure.
So first and foremost, I think we can start with the first decision. First decision around, should company invest in generative AI? Like, how should they be thinking about, do you have like an ROI structure in mind for what would it look like? Or what kind of components need to be incorporated there?
Well, we're in a really interesting place right now because to actually train the foundational models that are used for these types of systems, it requires lots and lots of money, lots and lots of energy, lots of like accelerators, like whether that's TPUs or GPUs. And so I think that's outside of the possibility for most organizations. Now, what is very interesting is that there are a lot of different places that are starting to collect models, like Kaggle, for example, is within the Google world, about like where people are storing models that can be reused that are maybe more highly specialized. So there's the possibility of taking these types of foundational models and then fine tuning them at a much cheaper cost, right? But also getting them more specialized to be able to apply. And so I think the idea of training from scratch these types of foundational models probably is just not worth the investment, right? But I think as we start to see more and more products or more and more models being brought into the open source world, it ends up being that you can run these things on kind of more not commodity compute. There's still accelerators that are potentially needed for that, but that's something that you could get from, say, like Google Cloud, right? Is that access to those types of compute? And so I think that's what it comes down to, is you should be very clear about where there is a benefit by using these types of models, and if they need to be specialized in some way. So, for example, you may want to be able to just generate text in general, but I'm betting you that there's a more specific way that you may want to generate text that could include things like what we refer to as fine tuning, but also this idea of like prompt engineering and templating, which means that you're kind of providing more context than just a search box. And so I think there's a lot of experimentation that still needs to go into this. So I would say if you are finding that you can get the type of solutions um, that are appropriate for your problem, I think you should experiment with it. I would just give a really big warning that because these systems are non-deterministic, you have to very much understand what are the failure cases and how bad is that for your customer and for the business. So something I've thought a lot about is this idea of like, how do we not only try to understand like what are the things that the system should be able to do, but also like what are the failure cases. And so I think like really having an honest conversation inside of your organization about like what is the worst case that can happen if this is the case. That may mean that you want to put certain guardrails around the experience, but it's still going to be very hard, right? Because these generative systems are really hard to rein in right now, and you can see this with like a bunch of like interesting research around just like jailbreaking of these systems, or even like creating new ways for them to just like do the wrong thing. And so that is something that if you just have straight up access to these types of generative models for your system, you're opening yourself up to a very broad possible amount of attacks. And so I would just say like using them in the right places in the right times. And when there's like low risk, I think that's the time to do it right now. That's the type of thing I would think about. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like the framework of like the possibility and low risk so that you can start being in the game, right? Learning about it. I think that that's a great segue to the second question the decision that we need to make. Now, let's say, hey, we have some low stakes scenario where we would like generative AI to help in our business. Where and how should people think about the opportunities and the challenges, and how to create maybe like an easy proof of concept to just get going and learning and bias against action.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of companies that are using this for internal use cases. So, I've heard from many different groups, just like, I think um, where they'll use these things as a starting point to be able to like generate some type of content or to get a document started or to kind of go through different types of problems that might come up in a certain situation. And so I think this idea of like using it as a starting point, I've actually used this a lot in my writing, just personally, where if I have an idea for kind of a concept or an article or a post that I want to write, I'll have one of these systems like Bard actually generate the article. I'll read it, but then I'll immediately write something else. And the reason why is because those systems are good as a starting point to get you like moving. So I think like a lot of internal use cases, as long as they have like a heavy edit cycle, is something that I think is really important. I mean, there's definitely some interesting things happening with like engineering autocomplete of like the concept of autocomplete for code inside of organizations as well, that I think it does seem like there's real advantages to trying that type of thing out, because you still need to then pass test like automated testing. There needs to be Q&A. There's a bunch of like things that are going into be able to like try to make sure that this code is correct in some way. I think there's some interesting things there. The only problem I would say is like there may be diminishing returns, especially if it's non kind of standardized content, or if it's not content that should be fictional in some way. Like if you really need it to be highly specific, it may not be the right thing to use in those types of cases. So that's what I'd say is like, I think like for internal use cases, getting kicked off, I think would be really, now some of the problems that may come up for that is like, is it appropriate for you to share this information with more public versions of this? So like, there needs to be an awful lot of work that still goes into kind of what does compliance mean in this new world where you maybe don't own the actual large model, like in the case of someone using Bard or someone using ChatGPT, they don't own that system. That system could potentially be used to then train the model in the future. And so are you leaking confidential or proprietary information in that case? And so I think like that's another thing that I think a lot of like HR and IT and security groups will need to get together to talk about. And if it is the case that you have that type of proprietary information, you may want to then pull these types of models that are available more publicly into more on-prem types of solutions. And so I think that's a real balance issue that you're going to need to figure out as you start to use these things too.
Yeah, I think that that was it's interesting as you speak because I remember reading somewhere that I think one of the companies have engineers using GPT or Copilot and trying to rewrite some of the code. But then are you basically losing now a bunch of your proprietary code if you like asking,
Yeah. Well, and aren't
GPT to
you
help
teaching people too, right? Like, are you teaching people in the same way that would learn about the specifics of this stuff? And so I think there's some really interesting stuff around that. And then I would just say too that there's a lot of regulation that is going to come down over the next like years, right? So right now there's a bunch of different tests going in front of different courts around like copyright of this type of content. And so like the last one just came out last Friday where it was that anything that is, it was actually reinforced that anything that is generated by one of these systems cannot be copywritten. And so that's very interesting, right? Because I think you end up talking about what is a transformative use of something, both from the standpoint of is the output from these systems transformative use, which means that it does not have to worry about copyright of the content that's used to train it. And then on the other side too, like what is a transformative use that then makes it copyrightable from the standpoint of like my own content in some way. So these are things that are going to have to come out like over the coming years. There's going to be regulation that is much slower than the actual court cases that are going to be happening based on precedent. So there's been a lot of really interesting work that's going to come out of that too. And so not only copyright, but we talk about the idea of like just data access and privacy regulation. Europe tends to be ahead of us on this, but I think that's another thing that like with the California Protection Act coming through, you're going to get like more and more patchwork of like how to use data and how you can use data. That I think is going to be very interesting and very hard for a lot of companies to actually be up to speed on. So make good friends with your legal contacts and your privacy contacts because they are going to be instrumental over the coming years to help you with these types of issues.
Absolutely. So, for folks who are joining us, make sure you drop in the chat if you have any question for Chris. He will find an opportunity to respond to you directly. Now, Chris, we talk a lot about, hey, using open source, using closed source LLM through an API. So, like calling ChatGPT, leveraging that model to maybe stand up a proof of concept really quickly. But then at some point, if you're concerned about your own, let's say, privacy of your data, proprietary data, you might need to move it on premises, right? Like build your own in-house LLM leveraging an open source model. So what are some factors that would go into shaping this decision?
Yeah, I think that like some of the biggest problems will be I think there's like two main things. So do you have the talent within your organization that can either learn or already can actually harness these types of models in a way that will then fit into your system that is more than just like calling an API, which I would say most engineers should be able to do. But like, are you going to now be able to like fine tune this model? Do you have the right types of like data handling policies and like systems to be able to do that? Are you able to actually perform a fine tuning of this model that you may want to do over time, right? And you're going to also have to then pull from these models as they can, because like what you're going to start to see is like even with the idea of like Llama being open sourced, right? Like there's going to be new versions of this over time, and maybe these types of models that are just released fully into the world may not always be the state of the art. And so I think that's the question is like, do you need something that's state of the art that might be more available through these types of like larger kind of corporations that are offering APIs, or is this good enough for you to be able to use? The second thing is also just the compute aspect of this, right? Like there's a real issue around access to GPUs right now, right? And so not just because like now blockchain is no longer like a thing that everybody's like focused on. That means that like they're no longer hogging the GPUs to be able to do that, or even like TPUs in our case, right? There's just a constraint on compute in general. And so I think the benefit of using one of these APIs is that you kind of don't worry about that constraint as much. It's actually up to the systems that are building these things to deal with like the efficiency and effectiveness of that type of compute that you don't have to worry about. If you end up hosting it yourselves, that means you need to buy like a couple of these like NVIDIA GPUs that are so crazily expensive right now on like the secondary market. So I think that's the thing. And I think longer term too, as these systems, if you do end up hosting something that is very large, the electricity and the use of electricity from a sustainability standpoint becomes a really big issue as well. So like, where are you getting clean power from is something that we need to think about longer term. So I think those are the types of things that you need to consider. Now, I do think that what this means is that There is maybe like another option, which is that for these types of open source models that are available publicly, you can still host them on the more generalized computer accelerator compute that these systems, that these like, Google Cloud would offer, for example. You can do that type of thing. And that I think means that there's like some model trade-off about this idea of like, is this the state of the art? Is it the biggest model that's trained? And you kind of don't worry about a lot of the issues around that. So that's like a high value type of service that would be available through an API. Or is it just that you need like the model from somewhere and you need to host it on some raw compute that you can get at a kind of more commodified price? So I think there's going to be like that type of thing that's a third option, is that you don't have to host it yourself if you're using kind of the compute from these systems in some way.
That's a very interesting angle to look at the different ways how, energies GPUs are consumed and how to think about creative ways to solving that. The next decision I want to think about is, earlier you talked about the divergent conversion process around decision making. What kind of teams or processes do you think companies need to put in place in order to facilitate this kind of ever evolving, fast, rapid changing generative AI product development?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it comes down to a couple things. So one is that something that's not possible right now could be possible very soon, right? So like in the case of generative models, there was this kind of a certain point when ChatGPT was released that really inspired the imagination of everybody, that like we can now synthesize language in a way we couldn't previously, right? I think that that's one thing, is keeping kind of a pulse on the technology progression as it happens. Now, it's not that it's going to necessarily change that rapidly, because like most of the stuff that's coming out right now tend to be improvements on these like large models. The original Google Brain paper that came out for like transformers was like 2017. There wasn't like really a zeitgeist around this until end of 2022. So I would just say like there is something about keeping an eye on this type of stuff. But honestly, most groups will not have access to that type of world-class research type of organization. And so the second two things that I think are really valuable then end up being this idea of qualitative information about your customers and the way that they actually think about the software and the models that they deal with. So this means like user research usually, right? So how do they think about the trust of your systems, how they integrate them into their lives, how they solve their problems, what are the types of failure cases inside of their problems? What are the things they're worried about? Right. So learning that through qualitative research is really, really powerful. And then I think linking that to kind of the data science side of the world when it comes to behavioral information and more of like what is going on is data science, which you want to be constantly having monitoring, not only about like the behaviors, but also the outcomes. And then how does that relate to all of the signals that you're trying to collect and understand? Like if you're doing a great strategy, for example, you should have like the equivalent, what we call like tripwires, which are signals that your strategy is kind of unmoored from the assumptions of the world that you used to have, right? So tripwires are a really important thing. Or like, what are the signals that our strategy is still valid in some way? So I think of that data science aspect as kind of the what is going on with the world. And then the why is really this qualitative user research, which then I think you, as a product manager, you use both views of those things about what is actually going on in the world versus kind of like, what do we understand the customers need, to then help kind of, what's referred to as abductive thinking, which is this idea that you have like a bunch of evidence, but you don't have 100% certainty. There's not a logical conclusion you could take from that evidence. And so it's not induction or deduction from those standpoints, but you're actually taking an abductive leap that's like an imaginative leap to what I think should actually happen. And that's like a hypothesis or an experiment. And so I think as a product manager, being really, really close to both those qualitative kind of researchers and the quantitative data science world and combining those inside of your practice, I think become really, really important. So I think that to me, because like all these generative AI systems, right? Like if they are going to be used out in the world, there's not only this idea of like when you train a generative system, for example, the ground truth as we would usually use to then train classifiers, like this is the ground truth that for this input, this is a ground truth output. And then you use that to train the model. When it comes to generative AI systems, though, it's highly subjective, right? Like this is the reason why all these different groups end up using lots of different people to basically say, like, is this a good or bad output from the model based on this input? And that's why, like, I think there was like a recent study where they were saying ChatGPT was a little bit more chatty because people thought that like longer responses just by default were better. And so they would give it a slightly better like thumbs up on that in that case. So I think like that idea of like how you actually discover all this stuff is actually through both qualitative and data coming from the live site. And that means also you need to be creating feedback mechanisms within your world. So it's never just like, I've seen many cases where the idea of like analytics or an afterthought, like we don't need to instrument this, we're just going to get out in the world. In this case, it actually is way more important because that is your feedback loop for the system. And same thing with not only just like analytics, but this idea of like being able to flag outputs as bad, right? Or being able to understand how did this output lead to a good or bad outcome for your customer, I think ends up becoming even more important. So all those things that end up being kind of like afterthoughts after you've had a big problem, I think become more important. Now, I do think though that what's really challenging about this stuff is that it will fail in ways you don't expect. And so from that perspective, I'm actually a huge advocate of if you had to, for example, like react to a really bad kind of problem coming out of your system, how would you deal with that, right? And so this comes from the world of like SRE, chaos engineering, where they actually like try out what would it mean to respond to this type of thing. And so I think that's like a thing that I don't think people do enough of right now with these generative systems is, let's say that there was like hypothetical like press release that came out that was like this horrible thing happened with the system. What would you do to, one, investigate the problem, and then two, take some type of action? And how long would it take you to do that? And I'm pretty sure most people have no idea what that is actually. And so just even practicing that type of thing as a group, right? Again, chaos engineering, they think about this from the standpoint of like turning off a system and see how that impacts everything. I think a lot of like policy advisors end up doing this through kind of like wargaming. So I think like there's something really valuable about like just seeing what would happen if you had to react to these types of situations, because I really do believe that we can try to do our best job possible to make these systems safe from the beginning, but there's always going to be cases, just like when dealing with human systems, that we don't always understand all the full repercussions at first. And so we need to learn how to be reactive in a way that is helpful for our customers. And so I think that's maybe the last piece I would just add about like what you need to put in place is you should try this out first.
That's awesome. I love the sort of tighter loop and collaboration between the qualitative and quantitative aspect, really understanding what's going on, be super agile about now that we have a lot more data, right, available, and then having that sort of active feedback loop, being putting people in the process and understanding that data, that iteration speed, I think is what's changed the most with this new wave of AI.
If you want to read more about that too, there was a Stripe Partners, they did this kind of study about what's next for user researchers. And so they quote me in that a good amount about this like linkage between qualitative and quantitative. And then I'm also going to be, if people are familiar with the EPIC community, which is a community of ethnographers, I'm going to be speaking at their EPIC kind of learning conference in a couple weeks around some of this stuff as well, about how to work better between UXR and product management. So people are interested in that. It's a really great community. I've always tried to learn so much from them. They're all like these PhDs in like sociology and ethnography. I'm just like this like amateur studier of this type of thing, but I think it's like a really important aspect of the world, and we should definitely be dealing and working closer with those people.
Yeah. So we're almost coming up on time. The last question, the decision that I want to make is that a lot of companies are creating what they call, I think, GPT wrappers, right? They, have an application and then they call GPT. So companies are saying there's no defensibility, no moats in this new AI era. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, prompt engineering as a skill, right? It's still very unclear whether it is going to be a long-term thing, because there's a lot of variability in it. Like even just between like model versions, you can get vastly different responses from the model with your prompt. And so it's one of those things you're going to have to constantly like kind of iterate over time and be reactive to if you do build on top of these types of systems. What I would say though is the moat isn't actually like the perfect prompt or being on top of the perfect prompts for these systems. It's actually how do you build a relationship with your customer, which I think is a very classic type of product management thing, right? Like over the last couple of years, we've seen this, like there was a fascination with marketplaces for a little while, whether it was like two-sided or n-sided marketplaces and how to build those. More recently, over the last couple of years, we saw a lot around like how do you build communities for your products, right? And so that terminology around community, these are really just ways of talking about the fact that we need to build really great relationships with our customers. So to me, I think if you're basing everything off of the fact that you're going to create the perfect prompt and it's just going to be provided to someone, that is going to be commodified over time, probably. And it's also not going to be stable enough, I think, until prompt engineering maybe doesn't actually mean as much. Like I could be very wrong about this, right? Like I just think that there's a high probability that the variableness you get out of this, like the unstableness you get out of prompt engineering, is not a long-term kind of moat. But I think it's something that we're watching very closely, right? Because it's something that is very important. But I'd say it always comes back down to the relationship you end up building with your customers. And if you are using part of a wrapper around GPT for something like that or some other type of model, right? It's all the other stuff that really matters for you to build that relationship longer term.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things have not changed. The fundamentals of
That's right.
PM, right? Like, solving real problem, building that relationship, doing the hard work. I
That's
think
right.
it's just making doing the hard work a little easier with generative AI, but it shouldn't replace
That's right.
the need to build that customer relationship. Well, thank you so much, Chris. This has been a really intellectually stimulating session. I hope it is also for our audience. Really great to have you joining us today. Any parting advice or resources you want to share with the community?
Yeah, I mean, I just think in general, one of the biggest problems we have, I think, inside of teams is just being too certain about things. And so I would just say, like, providing the space for people to dive into and consider uncertainty and maybe what do we not know about the situation, I think will be really valuable for almost every team. So I would advocate people that and definitely check out the Uncertainty Project, because I think it's where I put a lot of my kind of interest in conceptualization of like strategy and decision making. And so I'd love to hear if people try out any of those things and kind of how it works for them. So thank you again for having me here. I'm really excited for all the
No,
questions.
thank you so much for having you, and hope folks have joined the session, enjoy the session as well, and learned something from Chris. Again, make sure you follow, subscribe to our newsletter on the event details page, and get a recap of today's conversation, and also future event update. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great weekend. Bye.